benefit rather than a structure that limits the grabbiness of individuals. This was done, of course, in the name of liberating people from those very structures that limited their grabbiness, right? And so freedom equals being able to excessively graze and have more animals, and there is no restriction on that. And somehow that was seen as a necessary and good thing to happen in both Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan. And new ways of dealing with those problems of the commons have not yet come to the fore. There may be good new ways of dealing with those issues, but we don't see them yet. And the result has been, in particular, in both places, environmental change and the displacement of lots of people for lots of reasons. Although I would point out that one of the interesting things about the study that Emil presents to us is that their group also studied those who were displaced due to the nasty consequences of Soviet period environmental degradation that came from digging up uranium and things like that. And so that is a different form of crisis, one that seems to not come on at rapid speed like a war or an occupation or a landslide, but instead is slow and mounting, and in the case of Kyrgyzstan, that allows the people who live in those situations to tell themselves these stories that, no, I can continue to live here, even though the children have cancer and we're all dying young and so forth, I can continue to live here. So they don't actually perceive their own situation as crisis. In Ukraine, of course, it is dramatic crisis, war, occupation, and that drove these rapid displacements. Although, as Greta points out, here too, people perceive a certain amount of choice. And from Crimea, a much greater degree of agency that those who leave left because of their political decision, a not to cooperate with Russia decision. In Donbass, it's more a matter of saving your life and deciding at what point your life is at so much risk that you must leave. The interesting things about Greta's paper, Greta asks us to think more about what people do in this situation. And she focuses on the emotional work that displaced people themselves take on to cope with their situation, to rebuild their lives, to try to have something that resembles a normal life. One of the elements of her paper that she didn't really bring out was a sort of devolution of responsibility that happens in the capitalist situation of Ukraine or in sort of neoliberalism. It is the individual's responsibility to do their own emotional work, to find the counselor, to work on their own attitudes, to come up with a happy narrative that says, yes, I was displaced, but this is a starting over. I can do something new here. And she points out that that capacity is different for the people from these two different displacement situations. The political refugee can adopt the story of, I have chosen something new. The war refugee in Ukraine faces a particularly interesting situation because they get very little support and they in fact bear the emotional blame of the rest of society for somehow being culpable in this war situation. It's as if it's their fault that things are turbulent that way. So we get attention here actually to what the state does in all of these situations, and naturally I'm going to bring it back to that, even though that was not the focus of any of the papers, really. It was perhaps in Dr. Rossabi's paper, in that he focuses on the change of system. And obviously, there probably were moments when the Mongolian government could have made different decisions, but they were under very heavy pressure from international funders to make the kinds of neoliberalizing decisions that they made. Still, at this point, obviously governments have agency, and those same government actors who feel free to steal from the people could be making different decisions about how to handle the current economy of Mongolia. None of those decisions, though, right now seem to be fostering new forms of collective, shared responsibility for environment, for grazing, for self-regulating herders or anything like that. There might be ways of fostering that. Perhaps Mongolia needs a little bit more thought on that side. Kyrgyzstan kind of stands out from the other examples here because the government of Kyrgyzstan actually has a Ministry of Emergency Situations that carries out the sort of solution that we might have thought of as a Soviet-era solution, which is, here is a problem in this area, here is some land, move the people there and give them something. However, the decisions that are made there are made in this kind of post-Soviet neoliberal world where the solution is send the people there, give them money, and tell them each to build their own house. And I would contrast this with what was done in exactly the same regions 30 or 40 years earlier, which was send the people there and build them a bunch of apartments, and then more land is actually available so that they can have a little garden. And this is not the current solution. It's cover every inch of land with little houses, and there is nothing left for anybody to have a little garden. So there seems to be this approach that is help solve the problem, but perhaps it's not actually thought through in the longest term way, and it really devolves responsibility once again on individuals, on families, to resolve their own problems by, say, sending people off to Russia to get remittances and things like that, as opposed to really thinking through how an economy, not just a community can be moved, but how their economy can be reconstituted. That's really not part of the picture in this situation. In Ukraine, I am really curious about the lack of support to IDPs, which seems like there's small amounts of monetary compensation, but not a real sense that IDPs need to be rehoused somewhere in some way. And I'm very curious about that as a political decision on the part of the state. In many conflict situations in post-Soviet space, states are actually making use of the displacement of people for political purposes to keep conflict going, to make sure that our population will continue to be angry at those people over there, as in the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation, for example, and I don't know what the Ukrainian government's thought on all of this is. And so I'm also curious about if there are 4 to 5 million people who have been displaced, perhaps. I know some of them have picked up and moved to Russia, and I assume many of the rest of them are dispersing through Ukraine and reconstructing their lives economically and so forth. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that as well. One more thing I was going to... I'm a historian. I always take kind of the long view, and I'm always fascinated by stories of displacement in the moment when they are happening, because of course in the moment when they are happening, they are very traumatic. And it seems, as in Emil's conclusion, that there are no real winners. And yet, throughout human history, people have been displaced again and again and again, and they show up in new places, and this story will be an element in their life, and yet they reconstruct, and they build new communities, and they become ensconced in a new place, and it is not as if community is always lost. I found this sort of narrative fascinating from the Crimean stories that Greta brought up. People whose cultural history over the past 100 years has been full of displacement and redisplacement actually have constructed their own emotional valences and their own narratives that seem to lead toward empowering people with the idea that this too will pass. Once again, we will rebuild. It doesn't mean that we are destroyed. And it's fascinating to think about those as elements of the emotional work of migration. Which communities have those stories and which of them are not working with those kinds of narratives? So, sorry for the really rambling and scattered comments here, but I'll leave you with that, and I'd like to ask all of the panelists to come up and let's have questions and comments and discussion. So we've got 20. Go ahead.
I'd like to pose a question to one each to each of our speakers. Actually, the same question to Boris and Emil. Situation looks pretty grim. Are any international institutions and agencies offering any sort of serious engagement and any hint of possible solutions? The UN or anything else? I wonder if you could comment on the two cases. Is there some basis for hope from the outside? And then for Greta, I wonder if you could comment on the demographics of the Crimean situation. I mean, I saw in the last year there was a comment by a Crimean Tatar leader that allegedly Russia there's now of course a bridge over the Kerch Strait. Russia has brought in as many as 1 million ethnic Russians into Crimea. I wonder, is there any way to know what the situation is and what impact have those changes had?
Well, there are hopeful signs. There are international and local actors who have new ideas. In terms of the UN, I'm not sanguine. By and large, the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, they do have a representative there. By and large, what they do is set up conferences. And the conferences come up with ideas, and nothing is implemented. The group that I have found most practical and are doing interesting things is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the German foundation, which has opted for and suggested a number of reports, greater networks of cooperatives in the countryside that would work together to regulate the number of animals, the number of herders, the number of animals each individual herder could have, and therefore reduce the impact on the environment. The other thing is some progress has been made in specific areas of the country. In terms of other international donors, one of the great successes has been a program devised by the Dutch. The Dutch restocked Przewalski's horse. Przewalski's horse had died in Mongolia, center of Przewalski's horses. They took from their zoos about 40 Przewalski's horses and set up a protected area, they provided money for guards. This was done about the mid-1990s. The animals the horses herd around among other animals. The government has put in some money because they perceive it as a possible tourist attraction. And there are now over 400 of these Przewalski's horses. There's been no destruction, and it's really worked splendidly. Internally, one of the great women who I was hoping would become prime minister, a woman who got the first PhD from Cambridge, any Mongolia, in geology. Rather amazing family, 1/4 Russian. My grandfather was a major scientist in Mongolia, and did a lot of work on flora, fauna, migrations of herders and so on. And then was murdered in the Gulag in Russia. He had Mongolian wife, became a doctor, and then the Mongolian doctor, the woman had 3 kids, one of whom was the real progenitor of the democracy movement in 1990, and was about to be named prime minister in 1998 when he was assassinated. No one has been accused of the crime. His sister, the woman I'm talking about, became Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of the Environment, one of the few non-corruptible members of Parliament, and did some good things when she was head of the Minister of the Environment, but has become so disillusioned with the corruption in government that she's now working on international environmental affairs and has moved to South Korea. I'm hoping that she's rebrought. She's young. She's only, I believe, in her early 50s. There's hope. Some of the, particularly women, not involved in corruption, pose the possibility of doing something that will protect the herders and move in a rational direction in terms of collaboration with herders. So it's not totally disastrous, as I'm trying to point out, but it's going to take some work.
Yeah, we can think of 4 different types of work that international organizations do. IIM has been interested in this question of environmental migration, and sort of they pick up on the study that we have done and then conducted their own. But IIM mostly works at the level of policy making, so they are engaged in working with the Ministry of Emergency Situation and with the State Committee on Migration, and they work at the level of laws and regulations. Then we have, as I already mentioned, UN agencies working on the reinforcements of dating sites in Malisu, in Minkush, and that involves a lot of money. Then the third type of projects are, and there's a number of different organizations like GIZ, the German Development Agency, and there is a group of ARIS, ARIS, and others who do a lot of work on the global small-scale infrastructure projects, like, for example, building a bridge that was destroyed by the floods, or re-establishing a road that has been destroyed in the mountains. And then the fourth type is, and this is something that is new and something interesting, the work that is, for example, done by Christensen Foundation. And so they have the projects, they have their own projects in agro-biodiversity, right? And so they've been working with the local communities, trying to introduce the indigenous kinds of indigenous breeds of sheep. And these are very different. Sort of, for example, if you take a traditional Alai sheep, right, it's very light, right? It's not very heavy. It doesn't produce much wool, right? But it's very mobile, and when it sort of grazes, it doesn't exert as much pressure on the grass as the types of sheep that were introduced during Soviet time. Okay? But they are heavy on to produce more meat, right? And they also produce more wool. These different types of engagements from the international communities are taking place. But speaking of how optimistic or pessimistic I am on the effect of these projects, I would say, considering the scale of the disasters and the large number of families which are affected by them, I would say they're not as effective as one.
Well, thank you for that very important question. You're right that there's been a big influx of military personnel into Crimea. So to speak to, you asked about the demographic situation, right? And so of the, between 1.4 and 1.8 registered IDPs, only 25,000 of them are from Crimea because there's such a lower rate of registering. So the UNHCR, through their work at the southern border, estimates that actually a better number is between 60 and 80,000 displaced from Crimea. And so there's a discrepancy in those statistics. What we do know in terms of displacement from Crimea is that it's between 95 and 97% Crimean tolerant. And so that's very important. And there's been an enormous reshuffling with the influx of military hardware, military personnel, their families, new apartment buildings being built to house them. So the people who live there say it's being transformed from a tourist mecca to a military base. They now have surface-to-air missiles that have a 700-kilometer radius, which distresses Europe. You mentioned the figure of perhaps 1 million Russians being moved in, and there again, there's kind of a wide range of statistics. I think that the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights did a monitoring mission in late 2017 and came up with 33,000. I think that's likely to be an undercount, and it also doesn't count the military families, right? That they bring wives and children. And then to address your question, Marianne, yes, in my paper I spend a little bit more time talking about how the work that people do on themselves can almost be thought of as a part of governance because it lightens the burden of the government. And I had many conversations with state officials about the level of benefits, and they were unanimous and very clear that the displaced population is a labor force. The displaced population is a labor force, and in keeping with that sort of move towards neoliberalism, they say, well, it's very important for the people who are displaced to understand that in Ukraine, if you want rights, you have responsibilities, and your responsibility is to work. So they have this idea that they want to avoid dependency syndromes at all costs, and if that incentive, the incentive isn't enough, if your work can't cover it, you can address your other needs through the system of disability, invalidency, and the various categories of invalidency.
So when I think of migrations and displacements, I'm always interested in social networks and communities. And Emil mentioned this at the very end. You said tribal identities have been destroyed across Kyrgyzstan as a result of this. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. To what degree I'm a little surprised to hear that tribal identities were intact even after the Soviet period across Kyrgyzstan. I have that question for Morris. To what degree were tribal identities, intact in Mongolia? And then my question is really, so when a lot of these people do this rural to urban migration into the capital city, are they choosing to locate in particular sections of the city or in the suburbs, if you will, these GER compounds or these GER units, according to tribal identities? Since I know nothing about Ukraine, I'm not even sure if this question applies, except that my question was really about, I know that Tatars are across Crimea. What about Donbass? And are there similar sort of demographic or tribal or other sorts of identity issues at stake here? So.
Before I do that, let me point to two other disasters. Everybody is culpable. The Soviets, of course, had 100,000 people, 100,000 soldiers along the borders in Mongolia during the Sino-Soviet dispute. In 1987, Gorbachev said that they would move out, and they did so precipitously. Within 3 or 4 years, all 100,000, leaving behind environmental disasters of all sorts, guns, radiation, all sorts of, which have been slowly been cleaned up. There still are problems in many areas along the world. The second that didn't mention at enough time was the mining that has taken hold in Mongolia, which has, of course, impacted the pastoral peoples. Competition for water, particularly a lot of the mining, a lot of the natural resources are in the Gobi, and there is a tremendous shortage of water there. Mining requires a tremendous amount of water, and so the pastorals, the herders in those areas, another factor they're having to move is the shortage of water that's being used by both ninjas, that is, illegal miners, as well as regular miners. Rio Tinto, big Australian-British company, has gotten leases in the Gobi for copper and gold mining, and they were preceded by a guy who had, an American, unfortunately, who had the nickname of Toxic Bob, who did disaster to the Colorado River and somehow escaped. He was given the largest EPA fine of any sort, $25 million for harming the Colorado River. He somehow inveigled his way into Mongolia and got the most important leases, and then sold many of them to Rio Tinto, which has not been a responsible mining company since 2009. As to your question, it's hard to say. I didn't get the second part of your question.
Right. So are people who move from the steppe into the city,
are they continue their tribal
affiliations?
Yeah, they're more provincial affiliations.
Okay.
20 some odd provinces, and what's happened in almost every change of in the elections, the president almost always, the advisors, the most important people, come from his province, from his Heimlich, and that contributes also to corruption, bribery, graft. So it's not a good thing in certain ways. As to the Gare quarters, it's pell-mell. It's indiscriminate wherever they can find them. They've not been able to maintain those identities as much as they had in the past.
And yes, tribal belonging is perhaps more of a rural phenomenon than the urban phenomenon. And in the rural areas, it is important. It's extremely important. It defines your social status within the community. It defines where you sit on the table, right? During the celebrations. It even defines the place where you're going to be buried. Right? Sort of Professor Roland Hardenberg has done research on graveyards in Mississippi. So he mapped that by tribal locations, right? And sort of you would see that the main tribe is always in the center, and representatives of other tribes are in the periphery, like even graveyards. So in the villages it is important. And in the city it is less important because the population is much more mixed. But we have a similar phenomenon to Ulaanbaatar. It's called Nasritdinov, These are squatter settlements in the sort of edges of Bishkek. And they've been mostly distributed through the mechanism that is called land mafia. Yeah? A corrupted institution that involves city administration that sells public land, and it sells it to people from the villages via middlemen. Right? And what often happens is that middlemen work with the community in particular locality, right? And they collect money, from a number of villages who would like to obtain land in the city. Right? So in some ways, it would be more of a mixture, but we still, like, for example, the GIS maps that we did of the Bishkek Nasritdinovs clearly distinguish the difference between the Nasritdinovs on the south of the city, which were established during Akayev's time, right? The first president, who was from the north. And most of them are, populated by people from the north, versus Nasritdinovs in the north of the city, right, which were established during the Bakiv's time, who was from the south, right? And most of them are populated by people from the south, because the land mafia was replaced, by southerners when they came to power. So it's not, it's not that strong, but you still see some traces of it even in the city.
Yeah, thank you for that important question. I think the issues of identity are absolutely crucial in this, because the Crimean Tatars have always identified themselves as Ukrainian and pro-Ukraine. So one of the reasons that this occupation became an opportunity, or was perceived as an opportunity, even though they were displaced by it, is that they finally had recognition. It was an impetus for Ukraine to finally say, aha, the 1944 deportation was a genocide, and the Crimean Tatars are officially an indigenous people. So they got legal recognition that had been missing for 25 years, because Ukraine had sort of dragged its feet on that after they began, returning from their places of former exile in Central Asia. But also, I think at a more sort of interpersonal level, they created these friendships and alliances with people who were living in Ukraine, and they felt a sense of unity. They felt that finally they were sort of included in the body politic of Ukraine. And so I even heard people tell me, tearfully, that sort of the grand plan behind this is that when the Crimea returns to Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainians, Christians and Muslims, will have forged a much more unified identity. But you have to look at, so that's like a very emotional, interpersonal experience when they make friends with their neighbor, right? If you look at longitudinal sociological surveys of attitudes towards Crimean Tatars, they're not registering as having changed. So I think it's it's a process. It's a very long-term process. But yeah, identity is crucial. And then I think the other element of that is the people who left Crimea went to different cities based on sort of their vision for their future. So the people who were very interested in politics and political engagement and activism gravitated towards Kiev. The people who saw themselves as European, creative, entrepreneurial, gravitated towards Lviv because it's considered the cultural capital. And the people who are most interested actually in returning to Crimea just as soon as possible gravitated to Kherson and the villages surrounding Kherson. To be close to the border and go back absolutely as soon as possible. And then a fourth group went to Drohobych, which is a much smaller town, about 50 minutes from Lviv, southwest. And that was the more devout religious community. So the Hizbut Tahrir group, which was outlawed by Russian Federation, which is legal in Ukraine, right? Active practicing Muslims went to Drogovic, worked out a very positive relationship with the authorities there, their neighbors there, and have, formed a community in Drogovic.
Other questions? I think we've got time for like one more. All right, Bryce.
So my question is directed towards Dr. Uehling. You had mentioned that one result of this conflict has been this kind of breakdown of family dynamics and relations and whatnot. Do you see any potential for these family relations being restored in the long term, or is this such a salient issue that this Russian-Ukrainian kind of divide? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I do. I think that things were especially inflamed in the very beginning, and gradually people learn new ways of relating. But that doesn't negate the fact that many relationships have been permanently sundered. So, for example, a woman is engaged to a man, she's living in Crimea, she lives in the family home, she is pro-Ukrainian, the family is pro-Russian. After the occupation, they start calling her a traitor. And she realizes that she could never be accepted in that family or that community. The engagement breaks up. So some of them are irretrievable, others are bridgeable.
Yeah, I have a question. So, listening to your papers today, we've had a chance to hear 3 great case studies about displacements in Eurasia. But my question to all of you, basically, which is a terrible last question, is whether you can link up your case studies to thinking about the relationship with displacements across Eurasia, or do any of these displacements cause migration out of the countries that you've been talking about?
Out of the area. The migration to Korea of Mongols is dramatic. There are about 100,000 Mongolians who moved to Korea, mostly low-level jobs, and they provide wealth. They earn salaries that are grand from the standpoint of Mongolia, and they have been very much involved in keeping the poverty level from spiraling even further. So there has been significant. And now I can tell you that there's been a change. When we first provided scholarships through the CEUS operation to Mongolians who came to the States, for example, most of them came to the States, in public health, in education, in public administration, and so on. Most of them went back. That has changed. The ones who have been coming, say, the past decade or so, feel that if they get very good graduate degrees here, well-trained, that if they go back to Mongolia because of the corruption, they will not be able to get jobs that are commensurate with their kind of training. And so there's been quite a number who trained, for example, at Columbia, who have gone to Canada. They can't stay here for a variety of reasons or immigration, but Canada welcomes them. And there's been a kind of serious brain drain of people in these vital areas, such as health, public health, such as economic development, and the CEUS operation has stopped providing the scholarships basically to Mongolians. It's closed down its operation there pretty much. But if there are other funders, I don't know if they will go back to Mongolia because their skills, their expertise are not being employed.
So we have run over our time. Do you want to give the 2-second answer to that?
I'll just give it quick. It's a cycle. People send family members to Russia. They send money. The family buys animals, overgrazes, they pastures, develop landslides. Then they have to relocate themselves to other places. right? Where there is not enough rent, there is not enough pasture lands, and the only solution is migration.
Send more family members. Displaced people in Ukraine, are they going to other countries?
Yes, and what great questions have been raised. I really appreciate all these great questions that also help us tie it together. Yes, so interestingly enough, the Crimean Tatars in particular have been reaching out to their ethnic communities in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Turkey, and in the United States, the most significant of which is probably Turkey. So scholars and academics who could not continue to be scholars and academics in Crimea went to Turkey, were welcomed into the universities there. The ties with Bulgaria and Poland are deeply historic, and a lot of that activity has been through the arts, culture, ceramics, dancing, cuisine, and speaking of the displacement from Luhansk and Donetsk, you could even understand it as a form of voting with one's feet, because the people who were pro-Russian, and that number is greater, went to Russia. And the people who were pro-Ukrainian went to Ukraine, and that number is actually smaller. I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but thank you for that really important question.
So I want to thank everyone for being here, and thank you especially to our presenters for presenting really rich work. I really enjoyed each paper, and I think we all got a lot out of this, so thank you very much.